Hello everyone, and welcome to this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group, with Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson, bringing you all the chatter that matters across the franchised and independent dealer sectors.
Hello and welcome to this Motor Trade Radio weekday special. We're delighted to welcome back to the podcast Derren Martin, Director of Valuations at CAP HPI, joining us for his regular update on how trade values have performed with a review of March and Q1. So welcome back to the show, Derren.
Thanks, Curtis. How are you?
Yeah, all good here, thanks. How's things with you? You've had another busy month, I guess.
Yeah, another interesting month. Lots going on. Been an interesting first quarter. So yeah, plenty to talk about.
Probably non-stop at the minute, isn't it? It's probably, it's probably been non-stop since probably COVID, hasn't it? I mean, you're just constantly trying to get abreast of the market through COVID and now EV and everything else that's going on.
I honestly don't. I've been at CAP for 10 years. I don't think there's been a more interesting period than the last 3 years. Obviously, we didn't see any of this coming. The increases in obviously the lockdowns, then the increases in 21, and then strong year last year, and then this year a strong start this year. But then obviously the last 6 months have seen all the EV stuff that's been happening in the market. So yeah, it's been a fascinating period.
Yeah, I mean, as Curtis said, I mean, welcome back, and it's always great to have you on. And say busy sort of week for you as you close down the month of March and the first quarter. So before we start talking about the March figures, could we start look back at sort of Q1 and I mean, without going over the full last 3 years, but as you say there, strong start to the year, and what's been happening in this first quarter, and what your view is in some of the key points of you've seen it so far in sort of Jan, Feb, and March so far this year.
Well, I think if you cast your mind back to December, there was a little bit of concern amongst the whole industry really about how everyone was going to cope with the cost of living crisis, what was going to happen to the market, used cars, new cars, as we entered the new year. And we were sort of saying at the time, this year, no one's going to be logging on Boxing Day and looking for cars like that, like it's usually the busiest day. But it's been a lot more positive than that. And it seems like a long time ago now that we were talking some concerns about Q1, because it's been a really strong period. It's actually the first time that we've had the first 3 months of the year with positive movements in each month. So January started off a little bit slow for the first week or so, and then it picked up, ended up with a very small positive movement going into February. March went up by 1%. That's what happened during February's live. So February's live values for March was a 1% increase, and then March's increase for April was a 0.5% increase. So it's been a really strong period for the industry compared to where we thought it might be. I mean, those movements are only very small movements up, but we have to remember that values are already high off the back of what's happened over, certainly in 2021, and then not reducing by much in 2022. So it's been a really interesting first quarter, and obviously the big caveat on that is what's happened with EVs.
And that's your point, isn't it? I mean, you look at that strong first quarter of positivity, but actually that is against some really negative movements towards battery electric vehicles. So without the negativity towards battery electric vehicles, we'd have seen a very strong quarter for combustion engine, wouldn't we?
Yeah, and it has been really strong for combustion engine, and it's that EV world where there's been buying bans, there's been lots of sort of cautiousness from the dealers about buying. There has definitely been some cautiousness by the consumer as well. They're not so hell-bent on buying an EV now. There's been negative press. So whilst there is still demand there, it's not as strong as it has been. But having said that, the volumes we've seen on sold EVs are a bit bigger than they've ever been. It has been a lot. There has been a lot of cars sold, but at a price, and there has to be some pain that's been taken by vendors and by dealers on EVs. But yeah, for ICE, it's been really strong. The last few weeks we've seen a little bit of weakness at that older age, but generally it's been strong all the way through the first quarter.
And Derren, as you say, you've closed the book on March, and the March figure is up 0.5% at that 3-year 60,000 mark, which equates to around £30. How does this actually compare with previous Marches? And also, as a follow-up to that, how much how much are used values impacted over the course of March by the plate change?
So compared to previous Marches, it's strong. It's the joint biggest movement up that we've seen in March since we introduced Cap Live in 2012. So 0.5%. We saw that in 2014, a long time ago. Since then, we've not really seen value moves going up by that amount. And obviously, if you took ICE in isolation, that would be a 0.8% increase. So it has been strong compared to previous months of March. I mean, last year, although it was a strong year, values actually dropped by 2.1% in March. We did have a couple of weak months around this time last year. So it's been strong, impacted by the plate change. I think what you've seen this year, maybe more than in pre-COVID times, certainly, is franchise dealers that would tend to be a little bit switched off from used car activity to focus on new. They have continued to be very active in the used car market. So the impact of the plate change hasn't really been felt too much in March. It tends to be, obviously, you get a lot of volume in the new car market in March historically, and that tends to sort of be towards the end of March or into April before that starts to hit the market in volume enough to affect values. So it doesn't have a massive impact. But yet, to answer your first question, compared to previous months of March, it has been a strong period, but it's only been a small movement up. It's not dramatic. We're not having another 2021 where values increased in a sort of a crazy fashion. They've just been edging up over the last few months.
And that's an interesting point you make about franchise dealers not switching off this month and concentrating on used as well as new.
Yeah, well, that's where their bread and butter is. That's where they can make profits. We have seen some margin squeeze with trade prices being a bit high, and retail prices being high as well. So with trade going up, been very difficult to push retail up. So there's been a little bit of a squeeze on margins there. But overall, it's the bread and butter of the industry, the used cars. So it's demand has been very healthy throughout the first quarter from the consumers. So dealers have been out there looking to buy cars.
And before we talk about battery electric vehicles compared to petrol and diesel and put some context behind what's been happening in that sector, but what are the stood out in terms of rises and falls in March and sort of age bandings and sector types? Because as you pointed out earlier, that 10-year 100k has dropped 1.3%, whereas sort of your 3 and your 5 year have gone up, and your 0 to 1 has remained fairly stable.
Yeah, so when you look at by age, that 0.5 is at 3 years. 5 years has gone up by 0.4. So, I mean, they're small amounts in monetary terms. I think we said between about £30, something like that. But that is very much an average, obviously. We look at everything in isolation and move things accordingly. The weakness at the older age, those cars have been strong for this year. Maybe they can't continue to go up. There's a reluctance for dealers to buy work that might sit in the workshop, especially with margins being squeezed. They want to get cars moved off their forecourts fairly quickly. So they're looking at nice cap clean cars rather than average or below. So some of that older stuff, maybe not for them. But as I say, it's been strong for a long time. And that 1.3% is not, it's low in monetary terms. It's around £50. So, and we have to remember that values do tend to go down in normal times. We do see values going down as cars age in their life cycle. So by looking at sectors, all of the mainstream sectors at that 3 year point have all increased, not by much, as I say. I mean, probably the ones that have increased the most have been the city car, but that's only by 0.6%. MPV has only gone up by 0.1%. Super minis went up by 0.7%. and upper medium went up by 0.8. So it's kind of those three, super minis, upper medium and city cars, that have gone up by the most of mainstream sectors. But the devil very much in the detail on those cars as well. And on city cars, we've seen things like Fiat 500 and Peugeot 108 that have actually dropped in value slightly, again, by about 1%, whereas cars such as the Fiat Panda, the Hyundai i10, Skoda Citigo have actually increased by between 3 and 4%, which is about £250. So a strong performance for some of those city cars. And there's not so many of those in the new market now, because the OEMs are focusing more on SUVs and electric, and there aren't many electric city cars. So so that sector's kind of done well. SUVs increased by 0.5%, but large SUVs actually dropped by 0.7%. So it's been, the strength has been in those sort of medium and small models. And again, the devil's in the detail there, because we've seen things like the BMW X5, the petrol version's actually dropped by a couple of percent, whereas the diesels increased by 1%. So as you can see, we look at it in a lot of detail, and there's lots of different things going on there. But overall, most of the mainstream sector's strong, and the most of the petrol, diesel have been strong as well. So it's EVs and a little bit of that older stuff. Convertibles have been strong as well. They've gone up, which tends to happen at this time of year.
I'm going to say that the coupe cab convertible market right across all age points looks like they've all gone up. So maybe we're just at that point now where people start to think about that coupe cab convertible market. And we've seen that over the last 2 years go all over the place, haven't we? In some significant strength, as many in the early days of the lockdowns. I remember you saying the strength that people were going out buying those coupe cab convertibles, that second car with the money they had. Yeah,
buying a toy. It's the old accidental savers at the time, which seems like a long time ago now that we were talking about things like that. But yeah, those tend to get strong at this time of year when the weather improves.
And Derren, turning to EVs, you made an interesting point at the beginning that overall values would have risen 0.8% if you strip out EVs. So if we look at EVs, values across the board with EVs were down 5.4%, equating to £1,500. But you're reporting an actual slowing down in the rate of fall that we've been talking about for the last several months now. Why do you think this is?
It's quite dangerous to talk about EVs in general now. We've been doing that for sort of the last, the industry has been doing it for the last sort of few months, especially since Tesla made their new pricing moves in January. And it has affected the whole market, the drops, not necessarily because of Tesla dropping prices. It's because of a drop in demand and an increase in supply. So, but the devil really is in the detail on EVs, and we've seen that some have stabilized after some very hefty drops. I mean, that 5.4% compares to previous months where we had values decreased by 7.5% and 6.6% in the previous 2 months. So the average cumulative movement for EVs over the last 7 months is about 30%. So almost a third of values on average being knocked off prices. And what that's meant is that some have now stabilized. I mean, the things like the Model 3, you can now see those advertised between £20,000 and £30,000, and some of those are down near to £20,000. So you think about a Model 3, an aspirational vehicle. Tesla remains aspirational. That has led to dealers sort of coming back into the market on Tesla Model 3, and going probably not in massive volume whilst they test the market, but certainly Model 3, Jaguar I-Pace, that's another one that's dropped a lot in value recently and has now stabilized. And also the Audi e-tron. They saw some reductions early in the month, but they've actually ended up the month with some small increases. So they've done okay, but there are other models that continue to drop in quite large chunks. And we've seen the Golf Electric has dropped 10.5% this month, which is about £1,400. I mean, that's a lot of money in a month, but that's off the back of previous drops as well. Kia Soul Electric, Seat Mii Electric, they've all dropped by over 10%. Peugeot 2008, Tesla Model X. So whilst the Model 3 stabilised, the Model X has come down nearly £5,000 at 3 years old. So the Zoe, Volkswagen ID3, they've all continued to drop. So some have stabilised, some have dropped. And when you look at that lower end for some of those cars, things like the Leaf, that's dropped in value as well. The Leaf, the Zoe, if you're a consumer going in to buy a car, an EV, and you realise that on a monthly payment you might be able to get a Model 3 for not a lot more, that's hugely aspirational and a bit of a game changer. And I think of some concern maybe where that bottom end needs to sit now, compared to some of those cars that have dropped by 30% in price. So if they're now looking at sort of £20,000, £25,000 retail for some Tesla product, where does that Leaf and Zoe need to sit in comparison?
Yeah, no, that really is a dilemma for dealers, isn't it? Because it's an interesting point you make about the Model 3, the I-Pace and the e-tron all coming down. But are they down to a level where dealers can actually start to think about stocking with some confidence?
I think they need to keep a really close eye on consumer demand. And I guess my advice would be, yes, buy some of those cars that now look reasonable. There aren't many bargains in the petrol and diesel world now because of prices being so strong. But yeah, some of those EVs do now look very reasonably priced, but I wouldn't be going out and stocking up in huge volumes until we see what the market's actually doing with them. It remains a little bit volatile. They've recovered this month, and I don't see things like the Model 3 and the I-Pace dropping again in large chunks, but you never quite know with consumer demand. I do think consumer demand has dropped a bit, but also I think it will increase as we go into sort of better weather where range isn't such an issue, and there's not so much bad press about EVs. So I think there are opportunities in the EV world, but I would just be really careful about what you're buying and how many of them you buy.
And in the editorial, you do talk about the Model 3, the Tesla Model 3 being very much a benchmark car. So even for dealers who aren't thinking of stocking it, do you think they're looking more closely at the Model 3 than maybe other vehicles, just to see where those values are sitting?
I think there's a natural move to look at other vehicles where they sit in relation to that Model 3, with it being sort of a bit of a benchmark EV. Then you have to look at where other cars sit, even if they don't compete completely size wise. Then you have to look at where some of those cars do sit, and you've got cars that previously were maybe £3,000 below a Model 3, and they're now £15,000 above it because the Model 3 has come down so much over the last 6 months. I think there's Audi e-tron is one of those that you just kind of have to look at. Toyota, the BZR4, that you have to look at things like that as well. So yeah, there has to be some relativity in with used cars, and however much you manage your own RVs as a manufacturer, there'll always be relativity around comparisons.
Yeah, as you say, with the volumes of Tesla 3s that have gone into the market, I mean, it is certainly a peer vehicle that many will be looking at. And I mean, you touched on sort of demand towards EVs. What have the dealers been telling you about sort of stock levels and consumer demand in March, and obviously now as we approach Easter? You know, what's it been like in terms of that demand and availability of product in month of March?
It's generally been good demand, as there's a reason why values have gone up. So yeah, consumer demand has been strong throughout the first quarter overall. Again, petrol and diesel we're talking about here rather than EVs. But yeah, there continues to be strong demand. Spoken to dealers that have said March is just as strong as February was. So yeah, it continues. I think maybe towards the back end of the month there's been maybe a slight slowdown, but only very slight. So yeah, I think it's been strong. EVs, obviously the big caveat on that, but I mean they are still a very small part of the market. So dealers have been restocking on petrol and diesel. Probably the biggest problem they've had is actually finding stock at prices that they want to pay, because prices are high. And when you look at the retail situation, it's difficult, and margins are being squeezed, as I said earlier. But overall, it's been strong. We're obviously getting close to Easter now. Easter can be a bit of a watershed for the used car market when you get, especially when it falls in April. So the volume from March has had a bit of time to appear, and demand does tend to drop away. So consumer demand drops away. Dealers can drop away from them on the buying side as well. So you have that sort of 2-week school holiday period, which might have an effect on the market. But there's 2 million less cars have been registered. Over 2 million less cars have been registered over the last 3 years. So there aren't as many cars in the market as there has been previously. March will have an impact on volume, but not an overall dramatic impact when you look at the whole piece. So I would be expecting Easter to be a bit of a watershed, and it might have just a bit of a slowdown on what's happened with those increases, and you might start to see a small decrease, but no big crash, nothing like that is coming. So we do feel that there could be a small turn in the market, but only very gentle.
And finally, Derren, I mean, you've touched on the impact of Easter, but just looking beyond Easter, what are your forecasts showing for that period?
Again, we think there might be a small downturn, but overall values will remain strong. Pre-COVID, you get values that would be dropping every month. We've had 3 months of them going up, so I think you might see a continuation in May of what happens in April. You've got 3 bank holidays in May, which can have an impact. So I think we might see a small downturn over the next couple of months, but as I say, small and nothing to be concerned about.
No, and I think, from your point you just made earlier, the impact of the lost production over the last 3 years and continuing, we're not at full production yet, and the type of vehicles with this transition to EV is leaving that combustion engine market extremely strong because it's shortage of product. So yeah, it's going to get very interesting over this next period, because it won't necessarily be driven by high demand. It'll just potentially be driven by shortage of supply in the market. But yeah, it's really interesting, and I think from the points I've picked up there, in cautionary buying towards battery electric vehicles, but clearly people are buying them, people are transacting on them, because to your point, Derren, there's some good value EVs out there now, good price, good propositions, and I think many of the retailers seem to be finding their area now where they can talk to customers about them and get that sort of proposition correct into the used car market, either affordability or a good quality second car for the family or whatever that market is. So it seems to be making a little bit of a move there, but like you say, there's still a lot of cautionary buying towards that at the minute.
Yeah, you have to qualify the customer, because you have to think about an EV purchase. It's not like buying a petrol or diesel car, which you don't really have to think about, apart from is it the right size, but and does it do the job for me? Obviously with an EV, you can't just pop and fill it up with petrol or diesel whenever you want to. So there's always the thought process has to be right, and they're not for everybody at the moment. But ranges have obviously improved, and they are and they are going to increase in popularity. And let's face it, they are what's coming in the used market over the next years. So the consumer will need to switch back onto them, and dealers will need to get some confidence in buying them again. But at the moment, I would just be a little bit wary about what you're buying and how many of them you buy.
Yeah, just buy cautiously, watch an eye on searches and inquiries on them, and the pricing in the market, and as always, keep an eye on live, because that keeps close eye on the market movements, and that if that vehicle starts to shift, then you start to think about how you move that vehicle on quicker than you may sort of normally in terms of your dealer's stocking profile. So I think you're right. I think there is opportunities there, but it's you just have to think about them differently, don't you, Derren? I think really is the key with this.
Yeah, definitely. It's just as I say, they'll work. They will work for the dealers, but just a little bit of caution, I would say. Yeah.
So, I mean, as always, thanks for joining us today. It's always interesting to have this catch up. I mean, the detail is in the full editorial, which you can get off the cap-hpi website, or through the social channels, particularly if you're on LinkedIn and you are connected with Derren Martin at cap-hpi, then please do link up with Derren, and the full editorial will be on Derren's feed there. But that's it from Curtis and I. But we'll be back this weekend with the headlines as usual. And thanks for joining us today on the midweek special podcast.
Thank you for listening to this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group. Philip and Curtis will be back with the week's big motor retailing headlines on Saturday. Live, on demand, wherever you are, and on your podcast feed. In the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with Philip and Curtis, come on the show or send a press release, then email them at motortraderadio@yahoo.com. You can also join the Motor Trade Radio, LinkedIn and Facebook groups, or follow the podcast on Twitter. You've been listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast, bringing you all the chatter that matters.